Hello there, and welcome to 5 and 5, where I will look at something and give 5 things I like about it and 5 things that maybe I don't like so much about it. I think this is important in scientific critiquing to consider that there's multiple sides to almost everything. So when I look at something scientifically, I very often see some things I like about it and some things that, well, maybe I don't like quite as much. So today I'm going to 5 and 5 the most recent nutrition guidelines, nutrition and health across the lifespan, the new guidelines for 2020 to 2025. They literally just came out week ago, and I've gotten a pretty good look at them. I don't tend to, have the time to read everything in teeny tiny detail, but I read through a lot of it. Let me tell you what I'm not going to do today. I am not going to go through a whole bunch of scientific sources today. Nutrition literature is vast, it's crazy, it relies on so many different types of studies and the way they're done and things like that, that I could do this and it would take me forever, and I'm sure there are people more qualified than me that will go through these reviews and actually point out all the sources that would go along with them. I am going to speak from my sourced experience, so things that I know exist, and I will let you know that, I know that research is out there, but I'm not going to give you the source on this one. If you want specific sources, you can Google Scholar them. You can let me know, and maybe I'll do a future video in which I dive into a particular aspect of one of these topics using the cited literature, but I'm not going to do that today. Today I'm just going to go through it and give you essentially the quick and easy what I like, what I don't. All right. Let's take a look at these guidelines. Nutrition and health across the lifespan. So things that I like. First of all, I do like the fact that there's a lot of science involved in these things. The idea of the way these are set up is that there's science, there's guidelines, there's people involved, and there's a process. Now, is it a perfect process? No, definitely not. But they do try to back relate it to things. Another thing I like about these particular guidelines is that they did some focusing in this case. Let me show you the area that I think is the sort of most interesting on that. Some focusing in this case on the idea that people come from different places when they're looking at dietary stuff. And I like the fact that they not only talked a little bit about personal preference, which some previous guidelines have also said, start where you like and then make small changes, but also incorporating cultural traditions. We have moved away from some indigenous patterns in some cases, and many times they were the things that actually made the most sense. So I like that this is there. And then also consider budget, and throughout these recommendations, it notes that there are ways to get food, ways to find what you need cheaper, things like that. A lot of this country does not have the money for food, and I think that's an important thing to consider. So, my number one thing that I like is the personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budget considerations throughout this. Another thing that I like, and this is not much different from some previous ones, is the variety. They give you a lot of different options because those things are different and because humans are different. I firmly fall into the nutritional camp of every human body's a little different and responds a little differently to different foods, and I think that that's important. So whereas I can eat one thing, a friend of mine doesn't do so well on it, so lots of options are definitely important, especially in a variety of these different categories. So I do like multiple options. I like the fact that, like the last set of guidelines, they are focusing on the idea of nutrient dense and trying to make that a continued part of the terminology. I think nutrient dense is an important thing to talk about, and being able to say, oh, these foods are nutrient dense is a key concept. They do at some point define what they mean by nutrient dense. I think it's a little bit further up. And I'm not perfect on their definition, but at least in this case, we're working towards something. All right, I will get to the definition a little bit later. So far, I like cultural and budget sensitivity, I like variety, and I like nutrient density. 2 more things to get to 5, and they are both in the lifespan area of this report, because this report starts to differentiate at different years of life, which I really like. That's a thing I like in general, but I want to nail 2 of those sets down and note some of the things I think they did well. One of them is the part I'm glancing through right now, which is infants. So, here we go. Infants and toddlers from the time of birth until a child's second birthday. Couple of things I like what they did here. For about the first 6 months of life, exclusively feed infants human milk. And obviously they do note feed them fortified formula when human milk is unavailable, but I like the fact that we are promoting it as the most nutritious source because honestly, it is. Now, this does not mean if there are problems with breastfeeding that, women should not use alternates or supplement with alternates. I absolutely also think that that should be allowed, but I think we need to make the point that breast milk exists to nourish a tiny child and that that's a key thing. So I also like that later on they talk about for women who are breastfeeding to add a few more things. And the other big thing I like in the young child infant section is the note on peanut allergies. For infants with a high risk of peanut allergy, introduce the containing foods at 4 to 6 months, which is earlier than people used to think. The fact of the matter is that avoiding things often makes allergies worse. The way the immune system functions, the immune system needs to see a lot of things in that growing period when it is adaptable so that it can say, oh, these things are fine. And so starting as early as 4 months to get those nuts in is actually kind of important. When my sister had her kids, I poked her about making sure of that, and none of them have peanut allergies. A couple of them have some other weird allergies, but at least no peanut allergies. So that was a weird one that had gotten up and then down again, so I like that we're doing that. All right, so that's my 2 favorite things about the infant stuff, but that's still only number 4. Number 5 is actually in the, here it is, older adults section. Because they point out a few specific things with older adults, but the one that I like is that they point out protein. It has become very, very clear that older adults need more protein because they will lose mass. And it says right here, loss of lean muscle mass that occurs naturally with age. And that is a major problem for older adults. You need to get the protein. Now, these dietary recommendations do not set the numbers for that. That's another whole group, and those numbers probably should be set higher, and there are references I can give you for that. But at minimum, they're at least saying, hey, maybe you should eat more protein, and I appreciate that. So that is my 5th favorite thing about these. There are a lot of other small things that I also agree with throughout. I love my alcohol, but I recognize that it is not a nutrient useful food most of the time. Now let's move on to the things that I don't so much like about these. And they're pretty big, but they also aren't things that have changed much. But let's essentially take it to the basic guidelines section. I'll show you kind of exactly where my issues are, because they're all in one guideline section in reality. Well, there it is, number 4. Limit foods and beverages higher in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium. And limit alcoholic beverages. 2 of those 4 maybe. The other 2 we're gonna have some issues with. So let's talk about those. All right. So we talk about saturated fat a lot in the circles I run in because I eat a very keto animal product heavy lifestyle. And even though saturated fats aren't getting quite the kick they got in the last set of guidelines, they're still very strongly recommending that people eat very low amounts of saturated fat. So let's come down to where the fat stuff sort of lies, and it doesn't even have its own group. Fat doesn't even have a group in here. It pretty much says, oh no, you just shouldn't eat that. Oils has its own group. And saturated fats, you're pretty much told not to touch. This is inherently problematic. It's inherently problematic for a number of reasons, but one of the most important ones is that there's no evidence, still no evidence that saturated fat makes that much of a difference for overall health and mortality on its own. And this is one of those ones where I don't have the citations in front of me because there would be far too many. It would be far too complicated. But the realities are that replacing saturated fat from a good source with an oil is not automatically a health improvement, and these dietary guidelines make it seem like they are. And I think that's a consistent problem. So one of the things they show in their comparison chart, which has I think the 5 things I don't like in it, is indeed that you should specifically, and this one is specific, replace butter with vegetable oil. I gotta tell you, in my household, that is a huge no-no, because vegetable oils definitely are not good for me at the bare minimum, but there's also no evidence that butter is bad for me, and my butter comes from good grass-fed sources, so it's probably pretty good. So saturated fat, still getting the short shrift, and in ways that I think are problematic, which I'll get to in a moment when I get to my bigger one. Next, we're still strongly talking about cutting out sodium like it is the biggest bad guy on the planet, and yet we still have no good large-scale nutritional evidence that sodium is actually really super bad for us. And in fact, last I checked, a huge portion of your body runs on literal sodium, like your whole nervous system and a bunch of other things. And there are huge cases where lack of sodium is a problem. In fact, hypernatremia, which is where you have too much like water as liquid and not enough salts to go with it, is a shockingly dangerous thing that can happen to people. Sodium is way too strongly vilified and still without evidence. So that's 2. My third thing I don't love is one that's actually been pointed out by numerous experts so far since this has come out, which is that we still aren't taking a strong enough stance on sugar. So we still want to limit added sugars, and they do talk about that. But we definitely don't talk about it as a large-scale concept at all. So, saying that, let's see if I can find the sugar section quickly. So it talks about fruits, which, by the way, it notes that you should eat whole fruits without added sugars, but then it talks about 100% fruit juice. It's not an added sugar, but it's a sugar. And honestly, it doesn't really come with a lot of the other nutrients that the whole fruit does. So the fact that we are continuing to promote fruit juice, but we have this whole conversation about how bad sugars are for you, I have problems with. So for instance, here we go. Here's your drinks with all of your sugars, and it says, hey, don't do this. But it's still saying you can have 10% of it with added sugar. That's a lot. If you have a 2,000 calorie a day diet, 10% of that is 200 calories from added sugars. That's not the sugar in your food like your fruit. That's added sugars. And 200 calories, by the way, you would then divide by 4, is 50 grams of added sugar in your diet. That's more than most of the carbs I eat in a day. No, that's not true for everybody, but that's added sugars that you're allowed to have. Essentially, the dietary guidelines are still like, yeah, no, you can totally have 2 Cokes a day. It's fine, just don't go beyond that. It's not strong enough. They really need to nail that much harder. We're still not talking about these problems. All right. I want to go back to the generalized comparison little section up there that I was looking at earlier, because a lot of my issues come from the comparison stuff. I think it's above this. Here we go. This comparison chart makes me kind of the craziest because it is just not connected to things that make sense in most cases. So, for instance, up here, it notes that these are examples of calories in food choices that are not nutrient-dense and calories in nutrient-dense forms of these food. So it calls the 97% lean beef the nutrient-dense form because beef fat apparently contains no nutrients. Interesting. I wonder about all of those fat-saturated, soluble vitamins that I need and can come from such things. The next one down is then a very obvious one. Interestingly enough, the nutrient-dense form of the food is the cod by itself, and when you bread it and fry it, boom, it's a problem. Then the milk goes back to being the same thing, where the fat-free milk gets the high nutrient density score, and the milk fat is what gets the problem. Starting to see problems here. Low-fat dairy is definitely one of my issues. I like the full-fat mocha because it notes that you have espresso and fat-free milk, it would be a lot lower, but that the milk fat and the chocolate syrup are both of what brings it up, and not that you could add cocoa to it and make it better, and that maybe espresso is just not the way to describe this. And then the applesauce one I agree with. It's kind of like these comparisons make me a little bit crazy. Soda versus sparkling water. Yes, 100%. Full-fat yogurt with added sugars versus plain low-fat yogurt with fruit. Here's my problem. I would use the whole-fat yogurt with the fruit and still not have the added sugars. But again, the low-fat dairy, I think low-fat dairy really is my number 4. Is that I still think that we need to stop promoting low-fat dairy. There's no evidence anywhere that low-fat dairy is good for us. It is a removal process, and in many cases, especially in cases of women with fertility issues, we need higher fat dairy because those are the fats that bodies can use and make work. All right, now my final thing, which comes me all the way back around to the beginning, which is this concept of nutrient dense, which we are clearly not defining properly. US government, science, nerdy people who are making all of these things. We got to talk about what nutrient dense means. All right, so here's my biggest problem with this entire set of guidelines, because it's an overriding issue, is that what this says is nutrient dense foods and beverages provide vitamin, minerals, and other health promoting components and have little added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. Guys, that's not what nutrient dense means. Nutrient dense means more nutrients per physical amount of food. It has nothing to do with added things. Now, the reason that stuff with added sugars is not nutrient dense is because sugar is not a useful nutrient. It is not a vitamin. It is not a mineral. It is not a health promoting component. So when you add that, it's a problem. But saturated fat does provide vitamins, minerals, and health promoting components. So when you say lean meat over cuts of meat with fat, you're actually eliminating nutrients. That's not nutrient dense. Same with dairy. When you're doing that, you're eliminating nutrients. That's not nutrient dense. So we keep talking about this concept of nutrient dense, but not doing the thing we want. And in fact, for example, we say that pretty much all vegetables and fruits are nutrient dense. That's not entirely true. There are some fruits that are mostly water in a teeny tiny bit of like vitamin C and a couple other things. They wouldn't really be nutrient dense. Now, they're good for filling you up in a whole foods manner, but they're not nutrient dense. Same with vegetables. Let's talk about the nutrient density of iceberg lettuce. Yeah, it's non-existent. Maybe not non, but like so close. Beans, are one of my killers because they have some level of nutrient density. A lot of that is fiber, and there's some leveled question as to whether fiber is a nutrient everybody needs. But they come with an awful lot of starch per protein. I'm not sure if that's nutrient dense. Starch is not a necessary nutrient. It's not really a vitamin or a mineral. It's the protein that comes with that stuff. Therefore, are beans more nutrient dense than a good cut of meat? Probably not. So the fact that we still talk about low-fat dairy, lean meats, and poultry in our nutrient-dense foods without actually providing the numerics on how much nutrient you get out of those continues to be problematic. So we're going to promote nutrient dense. We really need to promote nutrient dense and be really honest about what we mean by nutrients. All right, so that's my overview of the guidelines. So I like their notes on variety. I like that they use nutrient density even if they do it wrong. I like that their focus is now on lifespan and they note some specific things about it, and that they bring in cultural food sources and budget as concepts throughout this thing. However, we are still vilifying saturated fat and sodium with no good evidence. We are not limiting sugar enough to make this worthwhile in a world where Let's be real, the number of diabetes levels are so high. We make comparisons that just don't cut it, and while I like that we use the word nutrient dense, we need to define it properly and use it properly. And that's pretty much my 5 and 5 on the current nutritional guidelines. Let me know what you think about them. It's not like we have to follow them. They're just, guidelines.